So we're continuing on in the epistle to Titus, as we have also been going through the pastoral epistles. So this morning we're looking at the issue of eldership, of elders. Now, A.W. Tozer, according to him, we may be known by the following. What we want most, what we think about most, how we use our money, what we do with our leisure time, the company we enjoy, who and what we admire, and what we laugh at. It's a helpful exercise actually to go through those slowly and think about what we do in light of what we know about God and His will. Where's our focus? Where's our attention? Now, of course, none of us are perfect, yet if there is really no aim or goal to improving ourselves before God, then we're really in danger of going backwards in our relationship with Him. And in this passage today, we see that Paul instructs Titus to appoint elders in every city on the island of Crete. The instruction raises the bar really on how these men here are to live their lives before God, these elders who are going to be appointed. But these standards, though, specified here for elders, they really become the goal for every Christian. Every Christian ought to aspire to these standards. Now, of course, elders are human. None of us are perfect. And yet, there are standards to which we must aspire to, or else we go backwards in our relationship with God. That's the reality. Now, we might say that we are saved from our sin, and rightly so. Praise God, really, for His grace in Jesus Christ. However, does this mean that we love our sin? Does it mean that we keep to our sin? Does that mean that we can live now by this low standard, keeping a low moral bar before God? You see, if the basis of our salvation is restoration with God, right, reconciliation with Him, into a right and blessed relationship with God, should that not radically change how we think about sin and how we live before God compared to when we were an unbeliever? Shouldn't that change? Should we not now desire the high moral bar? Should we not now loathe the sin that had us condemned? Should we not desire now to please our God with our whole heart? Isn't that what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ? If not, then what are we saved from? I mean, if it's not from our selfishness, from our sinful lifestyle, where we had the moral bar right down there in the gutter. If we're not saved from that, what are we saved from? So therefore, it is entirely understandable that the leadership of the church should be exemplars with lives that aspire to a high moral standard, lives that reflect the character and practices of Jesus. Now, it appears that on the island of Crete, it was evangelized sometime after Paul's first imprisonment in Rome. The book of Acts ends with Paul under house arrest, but renting his own quarters and welcoming all who would come to him. As it says there, he stayed 2 full years in his own rented quarters, welcoming those who came to him, preaching the kingdom of God and teaching concerning Jesus Christ with all confidence, unhindered. Here we have the island of Crete, that little circle in the centre, the red circle there. The wording that we have in Titus 1 verse 5 implies that Paul himself had previously conducted missions in Crete. He says here, For this reason I left you in Crete, that you would set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I directed you. Now, Paul did not necessarily bring Christianity to Crete, but he played a key role establishing order and leadership among the Cretan churches. You know, on the day of Pentecost, it just so happened that a number of God-fearing Christians had come to Judea for Pentecost, for Passover, and they would have heard the gospel preached there. So let's have a look at this from Acts chapter 2. When this sound occurred, the multitude came together and were bewildered because each one of them was hearing him speak in his own language. So they were astounded and marveled, saying, "Behold, are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that each hear them in our own language to which we were born?" And there we see Cretans and Arabs were among those who had come for Passover and Pentecost. And they say, we hear them in our own languages, speaking of the mighty deeds of God. And they all continued in astonishment and great perplexity, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" So Paul may not have established the churches in Crete, but as an apostle of Jesus Christ, he's got authority to direct these churches. The Cretan churches, obviously, as we look here, were disorganised and they were immature. And through Titus, the churches would put right anything that was defective. Titus is therefore tasked with, quote, putting in order what remains lacking. And how does he do this? Chiefly by appointing elders in every town. Now, that may all be well and good, but Titus is actually a secondary authority, and he's really not on the same level in authority as the Apostle Paul. And you know, I think this is one of the reasons that gave rise to this letter. It was useful to have these instructions from the Apostle in black and white, not just for Titus's sake, but also for the benefit of the churches in Crete, to which Paul expected him to communicate this letter. You see, the last words of this epistle make this clear. There it says, "Grace be with you all." The intended readers included the congregations there of Crete. The mission Titus has before him is the establishment of elders in every town. There would have really been only one church, we would say, in each town. And we also find that Paul's missionary strategy was to establish elders in every place. There we read in Acts 14, when they had appointed elders for them in every church, having prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord in whom they had believed. So Paul there was appointing elders in every place. The instruction on elders in 1 Timothy chapter 3, we went through that, assumes that elders in Ephesus already existed. But what we find here in the book of Titus is that there are none there in Crete. And the responsibility for selecting elders is now resting entirely on Titus. And ordinarily, elders would be appointed by current elders with the help and support of the congregation. But there were no elders, and the church is immature. And so Paul appoints Titus to go and appoint elders, and he would give them a criteria by which they would be appointed. And interestingly here, you know the term elder. Of course, it literally means older man, but it's not restricted to older men. It's about character, not age per se. But the elder is further defined here, as we see in verse 7, as overseer or bishop. There I've highlighted in red within two verses of one another. For this reason, I left you in Crete, that you would set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I directed you. And then in verse 7, for the overseer must be above reproach as God's steward. He's talking about one and the same person and role. The roles are synonymous. So an elder is an overseer, and an overseer is an elder. And what the overseer and elder does is a leader who watches over the life and teaching of God's people. You could think of an elder or overseer like a lighthouse keeper, who is not someone who's able to command the sea and all that happens, but whose job it is to keep the light burning, to warn of danger, so that others can make their journey faithfully and safely. So historically, there's a division that has existed in the church between elder and overseer. You may know of this, where you have an overseer or bishop who actually presides over a diocese. And a diocese is a collection of parishes, okay? Now, this is really not what the New Testament described. It's something that has grown historically. And so what you have with each parish is you have one church is usually assigned to each parish, depending on the denomination, and you have elders within that parish who oversee that one church. But then this hierarchy developed, which established a bishop or overseer over the top, overseeing what they call a diocese, which is several parishes that have the elders within each parish. So is a bishop or overseer above the elder? Not in this passage. They're synonymous, you see. Then, of course, you have it getting a little worse with the established Catholic Church, where you have the Pope, the cardinals, the bishops, the priests, and the deacons. And you have this elaborate hierarchy that's been established. Is it true that an overseer is above an elder? Or has church tradition once again followed worldly functions rather than the church plurality of local leadership? I would argue they have followed the former. They've followed the world's practice. See, on a practical level, such elaborate hierarchies tend to mirror what we call big government, you know, and this is not reflected in the New Testament scriptures. Here now, as we look at verse 5, Paul notes that Titus is to appoint elders in every town. He says, "For this reason I left you in Crete, that you would set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I directed you." So this is not Titus's plans or his personal preferences that he wants to exercise. The appointment of elders and their qualifications are spirit-directed through the Apostle Paul, the appointed person personally of Jesus Christ. The words "as I directed you" here in the Greek are actually emphatic. It has emphasis. So in other words, it's giving emphasis to this point. The authority for this appointment and command is here put in black and white so that all the congregations of Crete know that it comes from Paul himself. The emphatic "as I directed you" highlights Paul's authority, and it stresses that the elders must meet Paul's approved standards. Now we can see that these qualifications of elders are basically divided into an elder's home life and his character. The first is about his home life. Now some might wonder what his home life has to do with being an elder. Like, after all, you know, people say that a politician's home life is really nobody's business and that it is separate from his political life. I'm not sure that should be the way it is. I mean, a person who cannot manage their own home life is hardly fit to manage the life of a country, right? And the same is true here. If a person is unable to manage his home life as a Christian, he can hardly be fit to manage the life of the church. And that's the point here. The elders here in verse 7, the elder is said to be God's steward. Paul describes an elder as a steward, that is a household manager. Just as the man cares for his own family, shows how he manages his household, so an elder is to care for God's household, the church. The NIV puts verse 7 in this way, quote, "Since an overseer manages God's household, he must be blameless, etc." End quote. Beyond reproach here is used in verse 6 and also stated again in verse 7. You can see the highlighting there on your screen. Beyond reproach means blameless. Does this mean then that an elder must be faultless? Well, we all know, or we should know, that such a thing cannot be a reality in this present fallen age. John, in his first epistle, states that anyone who claims to be sinless is a liar. The truth is not in him. Such a position, we find, cannot be claimed in this present age. Beyond reproach, therefore, cannot mean faultless in the absolute sense. Beyond reproach actually means to be morally and publicly trustworthy. A life that consistently lives according to God's standards so that no one can justly accuse him. Two things are said to represent the responsible management of his home life. It concerns his wife and it concerns his children. He is to be a good manager of his marriage. He is to be the husband of one wife. Now, it doesn't mean married only once, otherwise widowers would be excluded from being elders. If a man managed his household well, but say his wife passed away and he remarried a baptised Christian woman, then he has done nothing wrong. His credentials are intact and there's no reason for him to be excluded. But on the other hand, if there was a divorce and a remarriage in inappropriate ways, then he would exclude himself, since he would not be said to have managed his situation, his marriage, well, according to God. The phrase is best understood here as, quote, "He must be faithful to his wife," end quote. Or he must be a one-woman man. That is the emphasis, as it's also reflected there in the NIV translation, which I think I have it. An elder must be blameless, faithful to his wife, as the NIV puts it. So in other words, he's not to be an immoral man, but one who is faithful to his wife. Now, the second aspect here is that he's got to be a good manager of his children. They are under his restraint. That's the operative word here. They are under restraint. Children who have drunken, disorderly behaviour, they're rebellious, reflect on the way they have been raised. And usually these traits don't arise overnight. They're reflective of parenting that hasn't managed that upbringing rightly. Now, that may sound a bit harsh and unforgiving, but it's not intended. It's actually reality, isn't it? And there is no doubt that parents love their children. But often what we find happening is that they raise their children based on their experiences as a child. You know, there's parenting styles here that has caused these issues to be raised. One of those is what I call the reflecting or the reflective parenting model. Now, most contexts of childhood experiences are completely different from one generation to another. A parent who has experienced certain types of negative childhood upbringing, you know, they will vow and declare to do the opposite with their children. You know, that's the reflective parenting model. But what inevitably happens is that they have not realised that personalities differ. Generational change and underlying assumptions change, not to mention the contexts of all those upbringings. And so applying their negative experiences to the raising of their children, they have inadvertently caused the opposite problem for their own kids. Why not just seek God's word for raising your family and apply that? I mean, why raise them on a knee-jerk reaction from your own childhood experience, negative childhood experience? So, for example, a person may have been overly disciplined as a child. They grow up, they become parents, and they refuse to apply any, even minimal discipline to their own children. It's reactive, reflective, you see. Now, this is only one area of possible breakdown of a child's upbringing, causing dissipation and rebelliousness. Another area is where Christians adopt worldly standards. You know, they'd rather trust the psychologists of the day than take heed to what God is saying in his word. You know, we went through that phase in the 70s and 80s where we saw the rise of the child-centred parenting model, and I'm sure that's still with us today. You know, the child becomes the centre. The world revolves around the child, where he or she gets his or her likes just granted to them all the time. This does come back to good management of the family. If a man who is selected to be an elder has managed his children well, where they're not accused of dissipation or rebellion, then he is qualified on this front to be managing the household of God. Now, let's clarify these words here. That is either rendered children who believe or are children who are faithful. You can have both those translations. The ESV, I think disappointingly, has children, his children are believers. You know, an elder has to have their children all believers. Whereas another translation, like the Legacy Bible, has this, having faithful children. So which is correct? Strictly speaking, either of them are correct, since the word here is the Greek adjective pistos. Right? It means faithful, can mean reliable, can mean believing. So that won't help us resolve its meaning here. Now, what I've mentioned in the past, I'll mention again. Context, right? Context needs to be consulted. So the elder has to have shown good management of his children before he can manage the household of God. We've established that. Rare as it may be, a single man, of course, can still qualify to be an elder, but the norm is that they would have children. So his home life reflects what his life will be like in church life and how he manages that. So in response to his leadership in the home, what does dissipation and rebelliousness represent, if that's in his home? Well, that his children really have not been following their father's lead. They have not been faithful to their father's wishes. They have defied him. They have gone their own way. He has lost control. He has lost the management of his children. So the question is this: how can all his children be expected to be believing Christians when we know that becoming a Christian is actually an individual choice of the heart? How can you guarantee that how you raise your children, they'll all be Christians? I cannot see that here. And this, of course, is not the argument here at all anyway. Management, you see, if you want to stick to context, management is the issue. And here, the man's children, I'm suggesting, must be faithful to their father's direction, who is raising them, along with his wife, in the ways of the Lord. That's my take. So now we come to the elder's character. We've just looked at how an elder needs to manage his marriage and his children well so that they may qualify to manage God's household. And of course, this is only one aspect to the qualification of an elder. We have to look at the second aspect now here that Paul lays down to Titus, and that's his character, what his character is like. But before the apostle outlines this character trait of an elder, both negative and positive ways, he states again the need for the prospective elder to be above reproach. Verse 7, for the overseer must be beyond reproach as God's steward, God's manager. Not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not addicted to wine, not pugnacious, not fond of dishonest gain. Now, under this world's influence, we are only supposed to say positive things, aren't we? But how interesting here that Paul is happy to list off negatives that disqualify a prospective elder. Take note of that negatives aren't always negatives. They can be very helpful to us. So we look at what shouldn't characterise the elder. And the first point is that he's not to be self-willed. Now, some translations have the word arrogant or overbearing or selfish. Now, just for the fun of it, I actually looked into the Latin Vulgate, and I kid you not, the word is superbum. I kid you not, non-superbum. With those words, S-U-P-E-R-B-U-M. And anyway, I just thought that was a little funny. He's a self-seeker, a pleasure seeker, which is what seems to be the meaning here. He's got his own mission regardless of anyone else's desires. So it's the person who thinks he is so much better than everyone else. And what we have here, there's a strong sense of self-importance, regardless of other people, looking down on others, and regardless of how God puts it. So he's ignoring what God says in the process. The second one is not to be quick-tempered. Now, does this mean that an elder is never to get angry? Of course not. What it means is that he cannot be short-fused. There's a need that sometimes to be angry, you know. You consider the devastation of people's lives. We shouldn't be dispassionately distant from that if they've been wronged in some way, and you just say, oh, well, sometimes you can get angry about those things. We know Jesus got angry at various times. He got angry at the hard-heartedness of people. He was indignant. He got angry at those who forbade children from coming to him. He got angry in God's temple, where he saw them using it to conduct business. And he made a whip and he drove out the money changers. He got angry. Paul spoke of being angry, but of not sinning, of not letting that anger continue beyond the day. So an elder, whilst he can get angry, must not be short-fused. He ought not be in the habit of, exploding in anger. That's what this is saying. He is not to be addicted to wine. I don't think I have to say too much about that. It's pretty obvious, isn't it? A person that's addicted to alcohol is going to have their judgment and their senses impaired. And whilst it's saying wine, it's really about alcohol, isn't it? Which is the ingredient that makes people lose control of themselves. And it's been said that alcohol is a social lubricant. Well, I guess that makes sense because people loosen up with it, and probably in ways that are not good, you see. So an elder cannot afford to lose his reputation as a Christian leader, as that affects both the message, his message that he holds to, as well as the ability to sustain being beyond reproach. He's not going to be that if he's drunk. Not pugnacious. There's a dog breed known as the pug because it's a breed with a short, stout nose. That's a pug. You hear jokes about it, that it has a short snout because it has chased parked cars and the like. Boxers also have been called pugs because, they're badly flattened faces from getting hit all the time. But pugnacious doesn't mean that. Pugnacious means to be a bully, a brawler, someone who is always ready for a fight, keen to pick one. An elder's not to be one like that. Then he's not to be fond of dishonest gain. Now, we know that as we've gone through the pastoral epistles, that this has been a characteristic of the false teachers. They are fond of dishonest gain. They peddled their messages for profit. Paul mentions this down further in verse 10 and 11. He says, "For there are many rebellious men, empty talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision, who must be silenced because they're upsetting whole families, teaching things that should not teach for the sake of dishonest gain." 1 Timothy, the deacons there who are entrusted with practical service, with the financial responsibility of the church there, they are also were required not to be fond of dishonest gain. That's in 1 Timothy chapter 3. You can find that there. So likewise here, the elders were to be men who were not to be lovers of money in context where personal profit really has no proper place in the church. You know, you're not in the church to make profit. So it's totally out of whack for an elder to be like that. So now we go, and we're on the final run now. What should characterise the elder? Paul's just listed off character traits that should not be in an elder. Let's go over the traits that should be existent in the elder. The first one is that he should be hospitable. In the ancient world, of course, inns were notoriously bad. And the philosopher Plato described innkeepers as pirates, who held guests to ransom. And inns were they were dirty, they were expensive and often immoral. Can you imagine travelling through the world like that? This is why Christian hospitality was so vital. That love and care that Christians would show to one another. Believers often needed shelter, especially during times when they were persecuted. But more than that, hospitality reflects the broader spirit of welcome, like an openness to others who name the name of Christ, even if they've come from different places or different cultures, different backgrounds. The elder is to be hospitable. He is to model that characteristic. And in doing so, he sets the tone for hospitality in the church, not simply in opening up his home, but opening up his life and fellowship to others, especially fellow Christians, by offering his time and his care. Loving the good. Well, Paul is not describing what every Christian would claim to value. We all should love what is good. He's actually describing here what actually governs the desires and decisions of a person. Paul's just contrasted qualified elders with men who are self-willed, quick-tempered, addicted to wine, violent and pugnacious, fond of dishonest gain. And against that backdrop, loving what is good is not only the basic morality, it has a counter-orientation to those other desires I just named then. An elder must not only avoid evil, he must have a settled affection for what is good. One can teach sound doctrine while privately resenting righteousness because it costs too much. Elders shape a church not only by teaching, but by what they praise, what they excuse, what they are patient with, what they are quick to correct. A man who does not love the good will tolerate what should be confronted, will soften what should be upheld, will avoid what is costly but right. So loving what is good means a settled affection for what God himself calls good, even when it is unpopular or costly. He is to be sensible. Now, this English word can mean practical or reasonable, like this sentence. Packing a raincoat for a trip to Melbourne is a sensible decision. Okay? But what it means here is expressing something different. It refers to a person who is sound-minded, self-restrained, governed by clear judgment. And at its core is the idea of a well-ordered inner life. A man with a sound mind makes sound judgments. Now, righteous, this is an interesting one. I don't want you to immediately jump to the Reformed theology and think of someone who has the righteousness of Christ, that this person is someone who possesses Christ's righteousness. Now, of course, if that were true, wouldn't that apply to every single Christian? You'd think so. You wouldn't be Christian if you didn't have Christ's righteousness. But it's not applying to that. You know, God is said to be a righteous judge, as Paul has written here. In the future there is laid out for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, etc. So here it speaks towards the prospective elder's dealings with people. He is to be upright. He is to be just in his dealings with people. As Paul says here, for the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all men. And what does it do? It's instructing us that denying godliness and worldly desires, we should live sensibly, righteously, and godly in the present age. So righteous there, being righteous, has to do with being just. Holy. Our second last one is holy. An elder is to be just, that is, to have right conduct towards men. The horizontal, right? He is to be fair, honest, upright. That's the horizontal conduct he is to be. To be holy actually is right conduct towards God. This is now the vertical. This is how he ought to be. He is to act reverently and faithfully towards God. His life ought to be pleasing to God. So you have the horizontal in righteous, you have the vertical in holy. Finally, the word self-controlled. Now, such a contrast can be seen here between Cretans, who their own prophet has described them as, quote, always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. Paul quotes them in verse 12, where he says there, one of themselves, a prophet of their own, said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. A man who is self-controlled has mastery over his emotions and desires, rather than being a slave to them like the Cretans, the characteristic of most Cretans. He's a man who exercises restraint over his temper. He does not lash out when provoked. He exercises restraint over his body. He governs his own physical appetites. He exercises restraint over his speech. He thinks before he speaks. His words should be helpful rather than harmful. And so with all these qualifications, it sounds like we're talking about a perfect person, doesn't it? Yes, the bar is high. But this is where a prospective elder ought to be. However, if you have elders where the bar is set low, then you cannot expect the church in general to attain to the high bar themselves. You need elders who are living the life of Christ if you have hope of having a Christ-like congregation. And your elders will not be perfect. But these traits we have looked at today ought to characterise the elders of a fellowship. Therefore, as I said at the introduction to this message, that it's entirely understandable that the leadership of the church should be exemplars with lives that aspire to a high moral standard, lives that reflect the character and priorities of Jesus.